This is a Yashica Mat 124G, and if you know your vintage cameras, then you'll know that it looks very similar to this, the Rolleiflex twin lens reflex camera. And that's because the Yashica was launched as a cheaper alternative to the Rolleiflex, which was very expensive at the time. And even today, second-hand values of the Yashica are much lower than the Rolleiflex. But is the Yashica any good? And is it worth buying? Or should you try and save more money in order to buy the much more expensive Rolleiflex? Well, in today's video, I'm going to do a deep dive into the Yashica Mat 124G and explain everything you need to know about it. And if you stay to the end, I'll show you some photos that I've taken with this camera, and you can judge for yourself whether it's for you. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, the Yashica Mat 124G is a twin lens reflex camera, and it's actually the most recent model in the sense that it was the last twin lens reflex camera that Yashica ever made, and it was manufactured from 1970 until 1986. And the mat in Yashica Mat was short for automatic, because before that, in order to wind the film, you had to look in the small window to know when to stop winding. But with the automat, there's no need. So in terms of specs, the Yashica has an f3.5 80mm taking lens, although there is a f2.8 viewing lens. So the reason it's called a twin lens reflex camera is because there are two lenses. The top one is for viewing and focusing, and the lower one is the lens that actually takes the picture. So you may already have noticed that the top lens has a wider aperture compared to the taking lens, f2.8 versus f3.5. And the benefit of that is that you can actually have a brighter screen when you're focusing and viewing and composing your picture. But the disadvantage is that you won't actually know what the picture will look like at f3.5 because you're looking at the image at f2.8. Even though it's quite a small difference, it's half a stop. So in terms of shutter speed, it ranges from 1/500th of a second at the fast end up to 1 second at the slow end. But it also has a bulb feature, which means that if you want longer exposures, you just set the camera to bulb mode, and then the shutter will stay open for as long as you've pressed the shutter. It does have a built-in light meter, which is just here, but in most models over time, now after sort of several decades, many of them don't really work anymore. And they also use a battery to power the light meter. And the battery that was originally used in this camera is actually no longer legal to manufacture. There are alternative batteries, I believe, but they may not give as accurate a reading as it should be. So my recommendation, if you do get one of these cameras, is to just use a light meter. They're not very expensive, and if you really needed to, you could use the light meter apps that are available for your smartphones, or you could even use the Sunny 16 rule, which is what a lot of people used to do in the old days before all this technology was available. I won't go into Sunny 16 today because that's a separate topic, but if you're interested, you can look it up and find out how to do that. So it's a medium format film camera, so it takes 120 roll film, which gives you 12 exposures because it's a 6x6 format, so the negatives are 6 centimeters by 6 centimeters. So you can get 12 frames on a roll. But this camera can actually also take 220 roll film, which is basically double the length of 120 film. And what that means is if you use 220 film, you can actually get 24 exposures on a roll of film instead of just the 12. And this does have some benefits in the sense that in terms of processing at least, you only have to process the film once, but you get twice as many frames. And it also means if you're out on the streets, you don't have to be constantly reloading film, which can really take quite a lot of time, can be quite fiddly. And when you're loading film, you may actually miss the opportunity to take a picture as it unfolds in front of you. But I know that some of you may try to point out that 220 film has actually been discontinued and nobody makes it anymore. But that's actually not quite true. I've recently discovered that the Shanghai brand of roll film have actually started producing 220 roll film again. So if you really wanted to, you could actually experiment with 220 roll film in this camera instead of the 120. So I mentioned that this camera can take both 12 exposures and 24 exposures in terms of the film length. So before the Yashica Mat 124G was launched, previously Yashica had two separate models. So if you wanted to use 12 exposures, you'd have to buy the Yashica 12, and if you wanted 24 exposures, you'd have to buy the Yashica 24. And so one of the innovations of this camera is that it can combine both, and you can actually use either type of film just by adjusting a slider on the inside of the camera. And that's actually the reason why it's called the Yashica Mat 124. So it's 12 for being able to take 12 exposures, and then 24 because it can take also 24 exposures. So the 124 signifies that it can take either 12 pictures or 24 pictures in the same camera. I'm not actually sure if my Rolleiflex can do that as well, because this came out in 1960, and I believe that 220 film was only available from 1965. So that camera probably can't switch between 120 and 220 roll film. So that's one of the benefits that the Yashica has over the Rolleiflex. And just one more thing in terms of the shutter inside this camera. It is a leaf shutter. So what that means is that it can sync to flash at any speed. So you can go up to 1/500th of a second with a flash on this camera if you chose to do so. So how do you use the camera? Well, after you've loaded the film, which is fairly straightforward, you basically wind on the film with this crank here, which rotates, and it just winds on until it reaches the first frame, and then it'll automatically stop. And then you can take the picture using the shutter here. It has a safety in case you want to avoid accidentally pressing the shutter, maybe for example when it's in your bag. So you take the safety off, and then you can compose by looking into the waist level finder. So you look downwards into the camera, and you can then focus using the focus knob on the user's left. So you can use that to focus and everything looks good. You can compose, and then you click the button here to take the picture. So how do you set the aperture? Well, actually the aperture and shutter speed are here. So there's a shutter speed knob here, and on the left, on the user's left, there is the aperture setting. So you just rotate those, and then you might be able to see that there is actually then an indicating window here that shows you what aperture and shutter speed that you've set. So let's say we're going to set it at f11 for 250th of a second, and then I can take the picture. But one thing you do need to be a little bit careful of is what's called parallax error. So what that means is if you're very, very close to the subject, what the taking lens is looking at is slightly below what the viewing lens is looking at. So you have to be a bit more careful in terms of composition, and you might have to adjust it by moving the camera slightly higher before taking the picture. If, like me, your eyesight isn't very good, there is actually a diopter adjustment inside the finder. So what you do is you click here, and then what you'll see is, hopefully, it'll pop up there. So then what you can do is you can look through the diopter adjustment, and so because it magnifies the image on the ground glass, you can actually have a lot more precise focusing. And then when you're done with that, you just flick it back to its original position. So I did mention the light meter. I used to take a 1.3 volt PX625 mercury battery, and I think mercury is quite a dangerous chemical, so they're no longer available. I believe you can use alternative modern batteries, but as I mentioned before, it might affect the performance of the light meter, so it might not be as reliable. And my recommendation is not to use the meter, but to use a separate light meter instead. So in terms of some pros and cons, well, in terms of pros, obviously the big one is it's a lot cheaper. I think you can pick these up on eBay for maybe around $350 compared to a Rolleiflex in the similar condition, which would probably cost you closer to $1,000. So if you're not sure about whether twin lens reflex or film photography is for you, this would be a really good way to introduce yourself to the format and see if you like it. Other benefits are really that although the lens is not as superior as a Carl Zeiss planar lens that you get in a Rolleiflex, the lenses in these cameras are actually quite good, and the results are really, really not bad. And I'll show you some of those at the end of the video so you can see for yourself. And a final benefit, not necessarily compared to a Rolleiflex, but in terms of other types of camera, is because you're looking down into the viewfinder, it's a lot more discreet because you can actually take a picture like this without having to raise the camera to your eye. And so if you're doing street photography and you don't want to be noticed, using one of these cameras is a lot better than a more modern camera. And in fact, when I'm on the streets with this Yashica, I find that often strangers will come up to me and ask me a little bit about the camera, or they'll, if they're a bit older, they'll remember that they probably used to have one when they were younger, and sort of ask me a lot of questions about, can you still buy film? How does it work? Things like that. And so it's a really good conversation starter. And usually if someone starts a conversation with me, I'll use that as an excuse to ask if I can take his portrait. And once you've established a little bit of a rapport, it's very hard for people to say no. And I almost never get anyone who refuses after having a little discussion first. So in terms of cons, well, it is a little bit more plasticky, if that's the right word, compared to the Rolleiflex, which is a lot more sort of metallic. But having said that, it's still very, very well built. And after 30 or 40 years, many of these cameras are still in very good condition and able to take great pictures. So should you buy one of these Yashica Mat 124Gs? Well, in my opinion, absolutely. They're very, very affordable. They take fantastic photos. And if you haven't done already, it's a fantastic experience taking pictures with one of these types of cameras. And I've really enjoyed using my Yashica ever since I got it almost 20 years ago now. So if you do decide to buy one, or if you've already got one, please do share in the comments your experiences and what you think about the camera. And maybe even let me know where I can see some of the pictures. Okay, so as promised, here's just a few photos that I've taken with the Yashica Mat 124G. I hope you enjoy them. If you'd like to know more about the Rolleiflex twin lens reflex camera, I've done a separate video here where I break down in a lot of detail everything you need to know about the Rolleiflex. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.